the role of Mahatma Gandhi and Prime Minister Nehru in achieving independence was greatly exaggerated. We have been told for decades that India attained her independence essentially solely due to the non-violent satyagraha of Gandhiji and his protege, Prime Minister Nehru. And again, if you look at historical record that has become clear over the last few years, that simply isn't the case. In fact, Clement Attlee, who was the Prime Minister of Britain, who was responsible for granting independence to India, when he visited India, I'm sure you've heard this story before, but he was asked pointedly twice about the real reason for why India got her independence. And both times he stated that it was due to Subhash Chandra Bose and the Azad Hind Fauj and the rebellious fervor that it had created in the Indian armed forces, which was evident by the 1946 Royal Indian Navy uprising. He realized that the British realized that once the Indian army turns against the British, there will be no place for the British to hide. So they decided that this time was right for India to be granted independence and for the British to leave. Because remember that the Quit India movement, that was the brainchild of Gandhiji and Prime Minister Nehru, that failed and ended in 1942, and India got her independence a full 5 years later in 1947. And when Clement Attlee was asked about Gandhiji's role in Indian independence, he also stated quite clearly that his role was, quote, minimal. And if you think about it, it makes sense that India got her independence through the actions of Subhash Chandra Bose and the Azad Hind Fauj and the revolt in the Indian Navy, because Veer Savarkar for a long time believed that the day the armed forces revolt, the British will run away with their tail between their legs, which is why he favored an armed revolution to inspire the Indian armed forces to revolt against their British masters. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar also reflected this same sentiment that Clement Attlee said in his interview with the BBC in 1955. He said, quote, that the British had been ruling the country in the firm belief that whatever may happen in the country or whatever the politicians do, they will never be able to change the loyalty of the soldiers. That was one prop on which they were carrying on the administration. And that was completely dashed to pieces post-INA and the 1946 Royal Navy uprising. They found that the soldiers could be seduced to form a party and a battalion to blow off the British, unquote. To add even more credence to these claims, Sir Norman Smith, who was the Director, Intelligence Bureau, noted in a secret report in November 1945, quote, the situation in respect to the Indian National Army is one which warrants disquiet. There has seldom been a matter which has attracted so much Indian public interest, and it is safe to say sympathy. The threat of security of the Indian Army is one which would be unwise to ignore. This is coming from British sources themselves. Lieutenant General S.K. Sinha, former governor of Jammu and Kashmir and Assam, one of the only 3 Indian officers posted in the Directorate of Military Operations in New Delhi in 1946, made this observation, quote, there was considerable sympathy for the INA within the army. It is true that fears of another 1857 had begun to haunt the British in 1946. And now I want to ask you, how many of you have heard these stories? How many of you have heard these interviews? I would be willing to wager very few of you.